Every sci-fi setting has to have some kind of space combat in it. We all know it's rarely realistic, we all know that even the depictions of space itself aren't realistic, but we don't care because it's awesome to look at and think about. And of course Halo is no exception, but it does slightly alter the rules. See, normally we get stuff like Star Wars, which may as well be the gold standard for cool space battles. Two mostly even sides duking it out like it's a 17th century naval battle on the high seas. Sure, sometimes one side or the other will be outnumbered or have a way better ship, like with the Malevolence from the Clone Wars or a Superstar Destroyer, or indeed the Death Star, but by and large the tech levels are mostly the same to make sure there's room for cool shots of lasers and fighters flying around. And then we come to the UNSC Navy. In Halo, the UNSC Navy for the most part does not get to have cool Navy space battles where two largely equal sides duke it out. The UNSC Navy does not have massive broadsides letting loose while they take on an equal foe. Space combat for the UNSC Navy is like if Napoleon had to fight the modern-day US military. Sure, he can maybe get a win or two off, but muskets are not great against an Abrams tank. But despite the fact the UNSC Navy was horribly outmatched, and it showed, I still love them. It had plenty of cool ships, it had plenty of cool tactics, and every other ship name is a certified masterpiece. So today we talk about the Navy of the United Nations Space Command. They may have lost almost every fight, but by God did they look cool doing it. But before we start talking lore, tell me, do you enjoy sleeping well and being comfortable when it's time for some shut-eye? I'm going to make the assumption the answer is yes, in which case have I got just the thing for you, Helix Sleep, the sponsor of this video. Helix Sleep makes premium mattresses that are custom made for your sleeping needs. With over 20 varieties, there's something for everyone, and since they're delivered right to your front door, there's no hassle involved whatsoever. All you gotta do is take the Helix Sleep quiz and it'll match you up with the perfect one for the best night's sleep possible. I've had the Helix Midnight Lux mattress for a while now, and it's great. I sleep like a baby when I hit the hay. Better than a baby, because I have vivid memories of my little siblings screaming all night, but when I go to bed on my Helix mattress, it's lights out for the whole night. I never wake up sore, and it's overall been a huge help for me in my rest. But Helix makes more than just that. Introducing the new Helix Sleep Mattress Topper. There's 4 varieties for you to choose from. The Dual Comfort one for couples who have different sleeping needs. The Ergo Align Topper for those of you who hit the mid-20s and your spine started folding in half. The Premium Mattress Topper for those who want some added pressure relief, and the Premium Memory Foam Topper for those who want to sink into their pressure relief. I got the Premium Memory Foam Topper and it was nice. I rolled it out when I was spending the night at a family member's house and I slept damn near perfectly. If you would like to get in on having the best sleep of your life, then look no further. Click the link in the description and pinned comment of this video to get yourself 20% off site-wide for Helix. That's 20% off site-wide with the link in the pinned comment and description. You deserve to sleep your best at all times, so get yourself something from Helix Sleep today to make sure bedtime is the best time. Now then, go gadget, Mac rounds and atmosphere. The UNSC Navy was formed during a conflict known as the Interplanetary Wars. During the 2160s, the two main isms of the 20th century came back for round 2, and the UNSC had to deal with German fascists and what I presume to be Russian communists from the sound of the name they had. In 2163, the UN seemed to wise up to the fact that they were living in a science fiction universe and specifically created the UNSC to be their spaceborne military arm. This was during the Mars campaign of the war, which was also the first time mass deployments of the Marine Corps were used. It was a resounding success, and the UNSC from this point on would have its navy devoted to all things that come with managing an early-level Stellaris campaign. Protecting trade routes, fending off the pirates that spawn right in when you think you can devote a bit more resources to buildings, that sort of thing. When the Shaw Fujikawa Slipspace Drive was created in April 2291, the Navy became an intergalactic organization and spread alongside humanity itself across the stars. The UNSC's Navy doctrine was quickly formed around carrier warfare, and if you don't mind me giving in some of my own input, I think that makes a lot of sense. As much as the Covenant loved turning worlds into dust and echoes, the UNSC wasn't really about that nonsense. If you go to war and annihilate the planet, then sure, whatever enemy was there is very dead. But then you don't get the world, and while terraforming ruined planets is viable in Halo, the UNSC is not working on 40K timescales, where a 100-year-long effort is a short lunch break. Carriers unleashing a swarm of fighters and bombers means you can engage in relatively low-scale combat while also leaving the planet's ecosystem intact for when you're done roughing the place up. More to the point, you can also carry the Marines to fight on the planet itself, which is a key part of the UNSC's core military doctrines as well. Helping that is that the UNSC was the top dog in space. The occasional pirate group could harass civilian vessels, sure, but then a carrier group rolls up and suddenly Blackbeard the space pirate is drinking vacuum after a few longswords turned his ship's hull into Swiss cheese. There was realistically nothing the UNSC Navy would face that needed massive battleships capable of frontline fighting. Their enemies were small in number, and if someone got funny ideas about rebellion, at this point in time the Marines were what you sent in to properly deal with the threat. Their official purposes were varied, but even they explained why carriers were so important. They were tied to both airborne assets in the Marine Corps heavily, for example, as both of them needed the Navy to ferry them around. Protecting shipping was also of course important, and the Navy also had to help the United Earth government proper in setting up and maintaining shipping yards. The real interesting duty they had was establishing emergency military government in crisis areas, though. This gave the Navy a massive amount of political power in the UNSC, since it was that division of the military that oversaw anything the government considered to be a problem area. And I understand why. A UNSC Marine hanging around an area might deter a few people from causing trouble, but a couple of supercarriers hanging above the skyline will work wonders for keeping order. This would continue on even into insurrectionist time, so this was where things did need to change somewhat. For those of you unaware, the insurrection in Halo was the catch-all term for the rebel groups in the outer colonies wanting to break free from what they saw as the United Earth government's rather iron-fisted control of them. They were as far as 800 light years from Earth. Why should they be paying those dickheads tax money? While the UNSC Navy was still undoubtedly superior to the Innies, they were well equipped enough that proper space battles had become a thing for the UNSC to worry about. During what would become Operation Trebuchet, the Navy engaged the Innie fleet defending the planet of Eridanus II after it was pretty handily taken over by them. The Navy itself would lose 4 destroyers during this engagement, which certainly isn't anything to be dismissive of, but they would eventually manage to retake the planet, even if the ringleader would escape to form the largest insurrectionist group, the United Rebel Front. The Navy would continue on fighting against the rebels, and their ties with the Marine Corps would only grow stronger, because again, you do not want to glass the planets that you would like to control. They tried that once to the planet of Far Isle, and the public reaction to that was about as negative as you'd expect from nuking a colony because there were a few rebels hiding in it. Aiding them in all this, mind you, was none other than everyone's favorite generator of missing children's reports known as the Office of Naval Intelligence. ONI was founded about a decade and a half after the Navy proper in 2178, and officially they're just what they sound like, the intelligence-gathering arm of the Navy. If there's word of some dastardly rebel cell on a planet that might be causing trouble, you send in the ONI spooks to go investigate what all the commotion is about. Unofficially, ONI is a fun cross between the Illuminati, 40K's Inquisition, and Big Brother. Everything from starting and funding rebels, to starting and funding alien rebels to further their goals, to of course kidnapping children to turn into soldiers is fair game. And they were of course helping to find the right targets and whatnot to point the Navy where it needed to go. It could even be argued that ONI is the reason why the UNSC decided to take such a hardline approach to the Innies. A report known as the Carver Findings predicted that if the descent in the outer colonies wasn't dealt with, preferably by force, then human civilization was more or less going to rip itself apart. And the higher-ups at ONI absolutely ate this shit up. ONI, depending on how charitable you want to be towards the agency that replaces children with sickly clones of themselves so no one knows they kidnapped them, either saw a chance to save humanity or a chance to further its power and influence. Either way, with their advice, the Navy pushed on, chasing after and combating insurrectionist cells wherever they found them. It's worth noting that while the Navy was far better equipped than the Innies, this time period did lead to some of the most important improvements it would receive in the coming years. Everyone knows about John Halo being turned into John Master Chief during this time, but for spaceborne combat itself, the Navy was given a nice little boost in combat capability. The least flashy is Titanium A armor, which would become the standard armor plating all UNSC ships would use going forward. The one everyone is actually interested in, though, is of course Mac cannons. The big guns never tire, and because coil guns are actually something entirely feasible in real life, you can go find some real-life science for yourself on these things. TLDR, a series of coils speed up a projectile until you run out of coils to speed it up with, and ideally, whatever you're launching this thing from doesn't have anything blocking its path because things are going to go horribly wrong if it does. Mac cannons range from lighter Mac guns on frigates to super heavy Macs on defense platforms. Those ones can fire a 3,000-ton shell at 4% the speed of light. Goodbye, anything in front of you. You can look up impact calculators to figure out how much damage that'll cause whatever it hits. I don't know the conversion rate of a few giganewtons of force to megatons of TNT, or if that's even possible, but I have to assume it's a big number. These upgrades couldn't have come at a better time, because as Operation Trebuchet continued, as did the insurrection, humanity was politely informed that their destruction was the will of the gods by some fellows with nutsacks in place of ears. Underwhelming as that might sound, the minions of those guys were 8-feet-tall lizards with a, shall we say, flexible warrior code of honor and a whole lot of religious fervor. And for the Navy, this was the start of things going horribly wrong for the next 30-odd years. I feel like I'm giving myself deja vu by mentioning this, but something to keep in mind about Halo is that it was not humanity having advantage on the ground, but the Covenant had the advantage in space. Per the Halo Wars timeline event you can unlock and access in the game, humanity won isolated engagements, most of which were on the ground. This is not humanity won most ground engagements. This is most of the few battles humanity won were on the ground. And even if that first bit was true, the Covenant's spaceborne advantage meant it wouldn't mean anything. They'd touch down, look for relics, and even if they got their asses kicked, they'd swiftly glass the planet with the untouchable ships hanging in orbit. No better is this illustrated than the battles that took place over the planet where first contact was established, Harvest. When the government of human colonial space sent a response to the Covenant's incursion, it was 3 human ships. A single Covenant cruiser destroyed 2 of them and heavily damaged the third in 14 seconds. When that third one limped back to Reach with news of what happened, the UNSC rolled up its sleeves and said, "Alright, you alien dicks, no more playing nice," and sent 40 ships to Harvest. 40 entire ships. It was by that point in time the largest spaceborne naval fleet in history. When they arrived, there was a different Covenant ship there, a so-called super destroyer. This time, the UNSC Navy did manage to destroy the Covenant ship and secure a victory, after they lost 13 of their own vessels for the trouble. To quote the at the time Vice Admiral Preston J. as he observed the aftermath, "It did not bode well." As the human Covenant war raged on, the Navy would only ever take more and more losses. The minimum ratio needed to succeed was 3 human ships to 1 equivalent Covenant ship, and that's not a guarantee of success. That's what the Navy needed to have a decent-ish shot at winning, assuming there wasn't some sort of superweapon or a Spartan on board. Entire fleets would be wiped out as the Covenant allocated more and more forces to destroying mankind. To the Navy's credit, even despite the massive technological gap, they weren't making it easy for the Covenant. Even as early as 2531, 6 years into what would be an almost 30-year war, the Covenant realized that humanity wasn't going to just roll over and die before them. That's what the plot of the game Halo Wars ended up turning into. Regret didn't just want the foreigner ships because they're both powerful and religiously significant. The Covenant was having to allocate otherwise defensive fleets for the war effort. That gap did still exist, however, and it was brutal, and with the Covenant having significantly more forces available as well, the Navy was pushed back more and more. By 2536, the Covenant had managed to push into the inner colonies proper, instead of just destroying planets that, as far as Earth was concerned, were just backwater shitholes to get tax money from. Every planet glassed was a lost source of manpower and resources, in addition to, the whole genocide thing that was happening. It got so bad that the different kinds of fleets and squadrons that the UNSC used to designate what was what just stopped meaning anything. For example, as per the Halo Fleet Battles core rulebook, there was at one point both expeditionary fleets and defensive fleets. The defensive fleets used to be seen as kind of a joke, essentially just being glorified tax collectors. Then when the Covenant came and started smashing things up, they were a desperately needed source of trained naval crews and ships. Go even further into the war, and there is no functional difference between the two. The UNSC had lost all ability to wage massed offensive operations without leaving what was left of humanity's planets undefended. Forces were cobbled together from whatever ships weren't left as smoking hulks drifting through space. Administrative dumb AIs the Navy had would organize them into squadrons and battle groups that had no actual tactical meaning, because there was no more forming a proper new battle group, just throwing together whatever you had and sending it to the front lines. By the end of the war, things were so bad that the majority of UNSC fleets were dead fleets, ones that had been completely destroyed to the Covenant onslaught. They were left registered as a way of honoring their sacrifice, and presumably so people in charge knew what was left alive of their forces. Sometimes a ship would accidentally end up assigned to one of these dead fleets, and that was about the time superstitious paranoia set in for everyone on board that unlucky ship. I imagine it's kind of like if you were a Roman legionnaire, and because some official screwed up, you and your pals got assigned to one of the legions destroyed in Tetteberg Forest. Kind of a bad omen, don't you think? How unmatched they were can't be understated. Standard missiles weren't enough to bring down Covenant ship shields, except in overwhelming numbers that weren't often available, and the hull plating of Covenant ships was also incredibly durable. Mat guns provided an answer to bringing down Covenant vessels, but most of the shipborne ones required concentrated firepower from multiple UNSC ships to bring down Covenant ones before they could be properly destroyed. Human slipspace drives were far slower and less precise than Covenant ones as well, limiting how quickly responses to invasions could be formed if they could be formed in time at all. Longswords were a phenomenal fighter, interceptor, and sometimes bomber, but Covenant Seraphs were every bit their match. There was no material field the UNSC had an advantage in, and few that were good enough to even remotely level the playing field in space. In spite of the brutality of the war, there were a few figures that were able to achieve repeated success. Captain Keyes was a brilliant tactician, outmaneuvering the Covenant on the battlefield frequently and creating what was known as the Keyes Loop Maneuver. Shame he turned into Gravemind soup, but he at least died resisting the Covenant and the Flood to the end. Danforth Whitcomb was an admiral who put his money where his mouth was, performing admirably, fighting off a Covenant boarding party personally, and setting a Nova bomb to detonate to take down a massive Covenant station as well as most of the surrounding fleet. Incidentally, this means that he has the single highest individual kill count during the Human-Covenant War, because the funny supernova in a can took out a couple hundred ships and a space station designed to supply all of them. He also has the most immaculate mustache known to mankind, and was one of the few people in Halo canon to get a kill from the grave metal. Several million of them, in fact. None of them, however, hold a candle to Preston J. Cole. This man, arguably more than even Master Chief himself, is the reason that humanity survived the Human Covenant War. Born to a family of farmers, as well as grandparents with a military background, he had a pretty boring childhood, spent most of his time helping out on the farm, and was a smart if boring kid. While you were out going to parties and talking to girls, Cole was writing papers on the viability of extended colonization for humanity. That's not a joke, that was a paper he wrote for high school English class. His teacher said that it wasn't very good. It also predicted the insurrection 10 years before it happened. Should have listened to who was clearly the main character, you stupid bitch. He ended up marrying a woman who had a child, and then for good measure, they had 3 more kids, though he would rarely see them, and at one point they divorced, on account of him being posted at the other side of UNSC space more often than not. His first big incident was simply called the Callisto Incident, which is often credited for being the start of the insurrection. The ship was getting raided hard by rebels, and a strike killed the entire bridge crew except for him of the ship that he was on. He signaled for surrender, and then told the remaining crew to move a missile from storage and take it to a cargo bay. He then proceeded to pull off a slight smidgen of war criminal behavior by having the missile launched into the rebel ship when they sent someone over to discuss surrender terms and whatnot. Victory was achieved and the rebels were then themselves captured, but that's the sort of thing you don't really ever want to do because now surrender can never be taken on good faith. Cole himself even resolved to never surrender again because he didn't think anyone would believe him. In the meantime, he remarried to a woman named Lyrene Castilla and had a series of battles against the same rebel ship named the Bellicose that kept escaping him. Turns out she was the captain of that rebel ship which got Cole in trouble with Oni. He avoided court-martialing and was in fact promoted to Rear Admiral, but this was the kind of promotion that was done to put you in a dark corner so you'd shut the hell up and get out of the public spotlight. In spite of largely being seen as a war hero, he retired quietly shortly after, and were not for the Covenant, he would have faded from history, most likely just a footnote about how you should make sure you don't accidentally end up marrying a terrorist. But the Covenant did show up, and Cole, for the higher-ups in the Navy, was the perfect man to send on to try and deal with this new threat over Harvest. On the one hand, he was still known as a brilliant commander, and if anyone could do it, it'd be him. On the other hand, if he failed, then he's the perfect scapegoat. A commander who's both done a pretty severe war crime and married an insurrectionist? If he lost, that's not a sign the Navy is utterly screwed. He was just secretly a goober this whole time. As I said earlier, under his command was the largest naval fleet yet assembled by that point, 40 of the finest ships of the UNSC versus a single Covenant superdestroyer. It was only through Cole's observations did the realization come that Covenant shields needed overwhelming concentrated firepower to take down, and I promise that's not as much of a no-shit moment as it sounds. It isn't just a brain-dead tactic of keep firing at the enemy until it dies, because sustained, continuous firepower isn't enough. The shields would just recharge between volleys. It takes a coordinated effort of several ships firing all at once to overload the shields and finally make the alien vessel vulnerable. This realization did bring victory, at the cost of 13 ships to 1 destroyed Covey one. Nevertheless, Cole proved he could lead, and so he was promoted to the rank of a full admiral and eventually given more or less free rein to take and command all UNSC assets he might need. His campaigning became so successful that his missions were outright known as the Cole Campaigns, and he never once lost a naval engagement. He only ever even retreated twice due to facing numbers he knew he just couldn't beat, and both times he just came back with greater forces to win the day. The UNSC was heavily outmatched, but at least at the start of the war, humanity controlled 800 planets, and all that industry was at Cole's disposal. These were by no means bloodless victories. In all of these battles, Cole lost dozens of warships compared to far smaller Covenant losses. But they were victories, and especially in space, the UNSC needed all the wins it could get. During one of these battles, he commanded 17 ships against 3 Covenant ones, one of which was a CAS supercarrier. At the cost of 11 ships, Cole destroyed 2 of them and forced the supercarrier to crash land. His forces even managed to capture a Singhili survivor, an elite simply known as Subject 386. It was here that it was confirmed the Covenant wanted to outright annihilate mankind for religious reasons, not just defeat them, but Cole also learned something important for humanity's survival. In spite of the fact the Covenant were leaps and bounds above the UNSC technologically, they barely had the slightest goddamn clue about human civilization. They knew humans were vermin cowering in the dirt, and given that the Prophets earlier broadcast to humanity in English, they knew at least some languages, but that was about it. Human culture, politics, and most crucially of all, knowledge of human-occupied space wasn't known to them. It was from this that what would become known as the Cole Protocol was created by him. It's very simple and the exact effects of it being implemented are hard to pin down, but it likely bought humanity several years of survival it crucially needed. There were 3 main tenets of it, and 2 of them were really all the average person needed to know. 1, if you are retreating, do not immediately jump to a human-controlled planet. Fuck off to some random destination through slipspace so you can't be tracked directly home. 2. If a ship is about to be captured, wipe the ship's navigational data and scuttle it if possible. The Covenant didn't know where the inner colonies are exactly, let alone the 2 most important planets of Reach and Earth, and that needs to be kept true for as long as possible. And 3 was really only for Oni. Fill slipstream space with antiquated and generally meaningless navigational data and whatnot, so the Covenant can't triangulate transmissions to find human-occupied worlds. The effects are hard to pin down because the whole point of them was keeping planets hidden. The Cole Protocol was most effective when things weren't happening, and judging something like this based on nothing happening is kinda tricky. But that being said, much of how the Covenant found human-controlled planets was through either foreigner artifacts showing the location of other foreigner artifacts, tracking devices, or sheer luck, as with Halo 2 and Regret tripping over Earth. It can be safely assumed the Cole Protocol and its creator bought humanity time it would have never had otherwise. There was also a caveat that you aren't supposed to bring Covenant equipment or ships back home with you in case there were tracking devices on it. This was almost never an issue because good luck to you, commander who thinks they can board a Covenant ship because your brain has been replaced with Oni propaganda. It was broken at least once though by Emil, and whenever someone brought that up, his superiors just pointed out that the Cole Protocol is a naval law, not an army one. Translation: the army told the Navy to piss off you spaceborne nerds. Cole's final battle at the Psi Serpentis system was perhaps the most impactful of all for how many ships he destroyed. In spite of commanding a fleet of 162 ships, he was up against more than 300 Covenant ones. Those would be bad odds if they were equally matched, but as discussed, we are in the realm of flintlocks versus battle tanks right now. Still though, he put up a good fight. Tricking the Covenant into splitting their forces, Cole maneuvered his fleet around the gas giant Viperidae before regrouping it to lay into the Covenant with his full might. As the remaining Covenant tried to attack, an insurrectionist fleet led by the Bellicos, and presumably Cole's rebel lover from earlier, jumped in to attack them as well. In spite of cutting down the vast majority of the fleet, however, another 200 Covenant ships jumped in to reinforce what was left of the first group. Cole's solution to this was simple. He told every other ship to leave the gas giant's orbit. And in the sequel to his war crimes stunt from earlier, he ordered every Shiva-class nuclear missile the fleet had onto his command ship, the Everest. He sailed it towards the gas giant and embraced the spirit of every Halo 3 match chat, calling the Covenant a whole bunch of pussies and that humanity was a lot more worthy to be the inheritors of the gods that the Covenant claimed to be. Predictably, given that by this point Covenant ships were commanded by elites, a notoriously honor-bound race who would let no insult go unpunished, the entire Covenant fleet turned towards Cole's ship and beelined it towards him. He plunged into the gas giant, and when the Covenant got close, he fired every last missile into its heart. With how large Viperidae was and how many missiles he had, it was enough that for a moment, just a moment, fusion was ignited in the gas giant, and the planet became a brown dwarf star. The entire Covenant fleet and the Everest with it were obliterated, and Preston J. Cole's service came to an honorable end. Officially, anyways. Multiple factors led both humans and AI to suspect he survived the encounter. The Bellicos showing up multiple times lends credence to the idea that Cole retired with his rebel waifu Castilla to become a simple farmer, something he had wanted for some time. The telltale times of a slipspace rupture just before Viperidae exploded were also detected, as was the fact that a ship Cole had requested for battle was never actually used. It's theorized that the Everest was a decoy, and Cole instead used this ship as well as a screen of Archer missile explosions to escape out of the system with. Couple all these with the fact that there were reports of humans independent of both the UNSC and Insurrection successfully fighting off Covenant forces seem to indicate that Cole retired here rather than die. Officially though, he perished here as a war hero of near unparalleled renown, only arguably surpassed by the Spartans. A stern man who did the duty that was asked of him to the best of his ability. Though humanity could have used his service for longer, if there was ever a man who deserved to stop and rest, it was Preston J. Cole. In spite of the efforts of Cole and countless other brilliant commanders, the UNSC Navy was continually pushed back. Even as early as the first few years of the conflict, colony ships such as the Spirit of Fire were repurposed as vessels of war, and mankind's spaceborne assets were depleted further and further. In spite of this, the Navy was still the most frequently seen of the armed forces, since by the last few years of the conflict, ground forces such as the Army and even the Marines were largely pulled back to be concentrated on Reach and Earth. Even then, some planets still had to be left to their own devices. The UNSC by the 2540s no longer had the resources to try and defend every planet, and many planets simply had to await their turn to be glassed without even token resistance from the Navy. Certainly callous, I won't say it isn't, but when you need to decide on defending either the heart of your military or Space Vegas, the answer is unfortunately for Space Vegas an easy one to come to. Come the fall of Reach, and the Navy was just about ready to give its final hurrah of the war, at least on the large scale of things. As the battle raged on, 60% of the entire UNSC fleet was deployed to fight the Covenant onslaught. This being a purely defensive battle where supermax stations were deployed, the kill-death ratio was better than usual, but Reach played out the same as every other planet before it, as everyone on it knew it would. Within a month, the UNSC's heart had been ripped from its chest, and at the same time, the battle for the planet Tribute saw 90% of deployed UNSC naval assets destroyed. After these two horrendous losses, more or less every naval ship remaining was redeployed to Earth, to defend humanity's birthplace and, quite frankly, just to take as many Covenant with them as possible when the end did come. The entire Navy was basically regrouped into the home fleet defending Earth, and when regrets stumbled over the planet, the last stand of the Navy began. Come Master Chief's escapades in Halo 2 and 3, the home fleet had been decimated. By the time Truth activated the portal to the Ark halfway through Halo 3, the UNSC could only afford to send a few frigates and destroyers to try and stop the key ship from going through. Even fewer ships than that could actually be spared to enter the portal to the Ark. As the war finally came to a close, the Navy was in a sorry state. Billions were dead, God only knows how many resources were destroyed, and the industrial base of the UNSC was currently ready to be fitted into a stained glass window. But there was still some hope left. With the Covenant fracture, the UNSC had the ironic position of being the faction most able to begin an effective recovery. The various species of the Covenant had to figure out how to do things on their own without the Prophets meddling, and the elites and brutes in particular had some hurt feelings to sort out both between each other and amongst themselves. Additionally, the discovery of Halo and the reverse engineering of various other foreigner sites over the course of the war had led to spaceborne technology improving by leaps and bounds. This culminated in the UNSC Infinity, the top-of-the-line flagship of the Navy. With energy shielding, the kind of MAC guns normally reserved for orbital stations, and being big enough that it probably has to have multiple zip codes, the Infinity was the pinnacle of what the UNSC had learned and gained. This thing could ram a Covenant ship without taking damage. That happened. Out of everything you can give 343 shit for, that cutscene is not one of them. The Navy would proceed to fight various lesser-scale conflicts over both foreigner artifacts and the various minor civil wars that were breaking out across the galaxy. Oni would go back to focusing a lot of effort on dealing with rebels, as well as meddling in the affairs of the other races for shits and giggles. The Infinity at one point Mac blasted Helios itself to assist the Arbiter against rebels, and though heavily reduced, the information learned from reverse-engineered Covenant and foreigner tech means that humanity's Navy will become far more equal to anything it may face in the future. And together, let's just agree to ignore Halo 5 and all that stuff, because Halo Studios /343/Microsoft all sure seem to want to move on from it too. To wrap us off, let's look at both the organization of the Navy as well as some of the more standout ship types it has to offer. As with the rest of the UNSC Armed Forces, the Navy falls under the purview of UNSC High Command, or HICOM. Due to the Navy's prominence, it is often called the Admiralty, but HICOM is made up of the most prominent members of all of the armed forces and dictates grand strategy and ensures all the different branches are working together. No Imperium nonsense where the Navy outright refuses to help the Marines or anything like that. HICOM will shit-can your ass if you try that nonsense. Ignoring Emil's collection of Covenant stuff, of course, but I like to imagine the Army's leadership just didn't want to find out what would happen if you tried to take his stuff. Below that, we have Naval Command, or NAVCOM. This is of course HICOM, but specifically for the Navy, ensuring all the fleets and captains or whatnot are on the same page and ensuring things are running smoothly. They were briefly more or less equal to HICOM, as in 2525, when the Covenant War began, all armed forces were placed under either them or Ground Command's purview for the duration of the war. Then there's the Naval Logistics Operation Command, which has the absolute mouthful abbreviation of NAVLOGCOM. These guys oversaw the distribution of resources and maintenance of the Navy. They're not the most interesting of folk, but as with every logistics organization, they're probably the most important in the entire organization. Cole couldn't have beat up the Covenant all the time if the people sending him ships, ammo, and replacement people were drunk off their ass and forgot to send him stuff, so pour one out for him. And finally, I need you to brace yourself for this one. We have the Naval Special Warfare Command, also known as NAVSPEC WARCOM. Whichever bureaucratic asshole came up with that abbreviation needs to be fired, preferably from a Mac gun. These guys oversee special operations, which during the Human Covenant War meant they were the ones to throw Spartans at some poor Covenant bastards that had to reach the end of the Great Journey a bit earlier than they had planned. As for the ranks in particular, if you Google image UNSC Navy ranks, you can find a couple images of it. One of them will be on screen right now. Much like the rest of the UNSC, they're more or less just US military ranks. As for some ships, we won't go through all of them, but just some of the highlights. Since carriers are important to the UNSC, why don't we start with the mother of them all, the Punit-class supercarrier. With 2 super heavy Mac guns on it, this is one of the few ships in the UNSC arsenal that doesn't necessarily need a million other ships around it in order to take down a Covenant one. It also had 2 smaller secondary coil guns, over 100 missile pods, and about 20-odd hangar bays to vomit out small ships like longswords on command. Consequently, this thing was expensive as all hell if the name supercarrier didn't tip you off. While this was pretty much the only option to take on heavy Covenant ships, every single one of these lost was an investment of crew and resources that couldn't easily be recovered from, and eventually making more of them just wasn't in the cards. By the fall of Reach, only a handful of them remained in operation, such as the UNSC Trafalgar, which was itself destroyed in the battle. A type of ship you're almost certainly familiar with is the Halcyon-class light cruiser. This is one of the first things we ever see in a Halo game, because this is the ship type that the Pillar of Autumn was. With 1 Mac cannon, 4 nuclear missile pods, and almost 200 Archer missile pods, this thing was actually one of the less well-armed ships at the UNSC's disposal. Believe it or not, the vast majority of them were mothballed by 2525, and even as late as the fall of Reach, some of them were still being scrapped to turn into other ships. Needs must, however, and when aliens are bearing down on you, sometimes you gotta make do with what you have. The Pillar of Autumn itself was one of the most costly ships of the war, in spite of being an outdated model, because it was at one point being fitted for a mission to capture a Covenant prophet. Then Reach fell, and, well, Halo 1 happened, and that never ended up occurring. The ship was already being replaced by the heavier Marathon-class heavy cruisers, and after the war, it was replaced by the Autumn-class heavy cruiser, named after the Pillar of Autumn itself. But you know what? If this ship was good enough for Halo Combat Evolved, then it's good enough for you. It may have been outdated and underarmed even by the UNSC's standards in the war, but these ships served with distinction and helped save humanity from a galaxy-busting superweapon, so show some respect. Our final ship, though not final thing to talk about, is the Paris-class heavy frigate. These are the bad boys from Halo 3, be it the mission to the Ark or the one that's hanging over the map's sand trap that you always wish you could fly up to as a kid. With 14 nuclear missile launch pods, 26 Archer pods, 12-point defense guns, and a light Mac as the main armament, these ships in a vacuum aren't that impressive, but their cost efficiency was amazing. 3 of these concentrating firepower on a single equivalent Covenant ship with their Macs was an effective strategy, and as a result, these were the single most mass-produced ship of the war for the UNSC. Since it had a lot of point defense guns relative to its size, it could fend off fighters fairly easily, and it had enough storage space inside to transport a few tanks and a decent amount of Marines to supplement a landing invasion, as shown in Halo 3. These things, as you might expect, tended to be destroyed fairly easily in spite of the benefits, but for comparison, one of these things is 1.3 million tons of materials. A Punit-class supercarrier is 650 million tons. While the exact material cost may differ based on what goes in them, that's roughly 500 frigates you can make for the cost of 1 supercarrier. It's no wonder these things were pumped out like nobody's business. And the last thing to talk about isn't a ship, but a space station. Orbital defense platforms. To once again bring up Stellaris, these are things you can build that are kinda eh. You can make them fairly tanky and fairly punchy, but they aren't exactly the main thing, at least in my case. Usually that's my fleet itself. But in Halo, the UNSC's orbital defense platforms are the wrath of God made manifest. This is where you find those MAC guns that fire a 3,000-ton shell at 4% the speed of light. For comparison, shipborne MACs usually require 3 odd shots to take down a Covenant ship's shield, and then you still have to fire another couple to actually bring it down. Orbital MAC guns will rip through a Covenant ship and shatter it like glass. Then, if the elite commanding the Covenant fleet organizes battle lines poorly, it goes through another one. Only upon hitting a third Covenant ship will it finally halt, which still destroys that third ship. While they can be powered on their own, they sometimes will require in an emergency a UNSC ship to dock with them so they can leech some power off of it to fire the gun. Some of them actually have a rapid fire mode, but those are so power hungry they have to be connected to ground-based power stations to continue functioning. Those kinds of stations really only came into large-scale play over Reach and Earth, since those were the most important planets, and you can rest assured that they were easily one of the main parts of why the Covenant paid so much in blood for Reach. And that's the UNSC Navy. Like I said, outgunned, outnumbered, and really in all fields except for tactics and strategy, pretty goddamn outmatched. But they held the line long enough for the Master Chief to save the day and for humanity to see the end of the war, so while they may be shown exploding as often as not, they're still one of the most impressive fighting forces in fiction there is. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the Punit-class supercarrier to my UNSC Navy, the cream of the crop in my battle against the Covenant. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. UNSC ship names for real, though, are flawless. The Pillar of Autumn and In Amber Clad are, of course, great names, but they've got some banger ones besides those. The Say My Name is a wonderful name for a ship, and how can you not like something like Two for Flinching as a vessel's name? Also, while I have you here, wake up, wake up, wake up, slip space ruptures have been detected, the Covenant are on Reach, wake up.